Iran doesn't need to fire a single missile. Israel is doing its work for it. So let me start with the most important sentence spoken on June 9th, 2026, and it was not spoken by Iran. It was not spoken by Netanyahu. It was not spoken by any general, any diplomat, or any intelligence official. It was spoken by Donald Trump. Al Jazeera reported that Trump said these exact words this morning. "We are in the final throes of what will be a very, very good deal." Final throes. 2 or 3 days. Peace imminent. And then, within hours of that statement, Al Jazeera reported that Israeli forces launched a series of airstrikes against Tyre, one of the largest cities in southern Lebanon, with nearly 175,000 inhabitants. At least 8 people killed, dozens wounded, thousands forced to flee. And for the first time in this entire conflict, the Israeli military issued a forced displacement order that included the Christian quarter of Tyre, a neighborhood that had been explicitly protected until today, where thousands of civilians displaced from other parts of southern Lebanon had taken refuge believing they were safe. Now, I want you to hold those two things together. Trump says, "Final throes of peace deal." Israel bombs the Christian quarter of Tyre. Same day, same hour almost. And here's the question that every mainstream media outlet is completely failing to ask tonight. If the peace deal is truly in its final throes, if both sides have genuinely agreed to stop shooting, as Trump has claimed repeatedly, why is Israel expanding its military operations in Lebanon to neighborhoods that had previously been explicitly off limits? The answer to that question reveals something about this conflict that is more important than any single attack, any single missile launch, or any single diplomatic statement. It reveals that Iran has achieved something extraordinary, something that no military operation, no missile barrage, no nuclear threshold crossing could have achieved. Iran has engineered a situation where Israel, not Iran, is the actor that keeps activating Iran's strategic doctrine. Israel, not Iran, is the actor that keeps destroying the peace deal Trump desperately wants. Israel, not Iran, is doing the strategic work that Iran needs done. Without Iran firing a single missile today, let us go. Part 1. What is actually happening in Tyre, and why this city matters. I need to give you the full context of Tyre, because the headlines are giving you the numbers, without explaining why this specific city at this specific moment is the most strategically significant location in this entire conflict right now. Tyre is a coastal city in southern Lebanon with nearly 175,000 inhabitants. It is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, home to UNESCO World Heritage-listed Roman ruins that have stood for 2,000 years. It is also one of the last major cities in southern Lebanon that still has a significant civilian population after weeks of Israeli military operations across the region. Al Jazeera reported that the Israeli military issued a forced displacement order for the entire city of Tyre, including for the first time the Christian quarter, where many displaced people from other areas had been sheltering. The order told the entire city to leave immediately before the attacks began. Now, I want you to understand why the Christian quarter specifically matters in the context of this conflict. Throughout this campaign in southern Lebanon, Israel had explicitly excluded the Christian quarter of Tyre from its displacement orders. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate signal to the international community, to the Lebanese government, to Western governments with strong ties to Lebanese Christian communities, that Israel was distinguishing between different civilian populations and protecting certain areas. Today, that signal was revoked. For the first time, the Christian quarter was included. NBC News reported that hours after Trump's latest optimistic assessment, Israel renewed its military assault in Lebanon, striking the southern city of Tyre and issuing an evacuation warning that for the first time included the port's Christian quarter. The attacks risked renewed fighting with Tehran, a day after exchanges that had threatened a return to all-out war. Risked renewed fighting with Tehran. NBC News used those exact words. Because here is what everyone in this conflict understands. Iran has publicly declared, in its formal strategic doctrine announcement, that attacks on the axis of resistance in Lebanon trigger an automatic response. The Christian quarter of Tyre is not an abstract geopolitical concept. It is a neighborhood in a city that is part of the territory Iran has declared it will defend automatically. Israel knew this when it issued the evacuation order. Israel knew this when it launched the strikes, and Israel did it anyway. Part 2. The strategic trap Iran built, and how Israel keeps walking into it. This is the analytical core of everything I want to show you today, and I want to be very precise because it is more sophisticated than it appears on the surface. Iran's strategic doctrine, announced formally on June 8, 2026, states that any attack on the axis of resistance triggers an automatic Iranian response. I explained this in detail in our previous video. The doctrine removes cost-benefit calculation from the equation. It makes the response automatic, it makes it predictable, and it makes the trigger condition entirely dependent on Israeli behavior, not Iranian behavior. Now think about what that means from Iran's strategic perspective. Iran does not need to decide whether to escalate. Iran does not need to risk the political and military costs of initiating offensive action. Iran does not need to provide Washington with a justification for further strikes on Iranian territory. All Iran needs to do is wait. Wait for Israel to attack Lebanon, and Israel will attack Lebanon, because Netanyahu's domestic political survival depends on projecting military strength. Because the Israeli military has operational momentum that is difficult to stop, because Hezbollah, which rejected the ceasefire, continues to operate in southern Lebanon, giving Israel ongoing military justifications. CBS News reported that Israel and Lebanon renewed a ceasefire agreement last week, but the Iran-backed Hezbollah paramilitary group quickly rejected it. Israel and Hezbollah have continued to exchange fire daily since the ceasefire came into effect. Daily, every single day. Hezbollah and Israel exchanging fire, every exchange giving Israel a military justification for further operations, every further operation activating Iran's strategic doctrine, every activation of Iran's strategic doctrine generating a missile response, every missile response giving Netanyahu domestic political cover for more operations. The cycle feeds itself, and Iran built it deliberately. Think about the strategic elegance of what Iran has constructed. Iran announced its strategic doctrine publicly, in 3 languages, making the trigger conditions completely transparent. This transparency is not a vulnerability. It is the weapon, because it means that every time Israel attacks Lebanon, the entire world can see that Israel is activating Iran's automatic response. Israel becomes the visible actor triggering the escalation. Iran becomes the actor responding to Israeli aggression. In the court of international opinion, in the calculations of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, China, Russia, Europe, the question of who is responsible for the continuation of this conflict has a very clear answer when the trigger conditions are published in advance, and Israel keeps crossing them. Al Jazeera reported that Trump warned Netanyahu, "You better be careful, or you will be on your own very soon," and then Israel attacked Tyre anyway. Who does the world see as the obstacle to peace in that sequence? Not Iran. Part 3. Why Trump cannot solve this problem, no matter what he says. I want to spend significant time on this because it is the most misunderstood aspect of the current situation. And understanding it correctly completely changes how you evaluate everything Trump is saying about imminent peace deals. NBC News reported that Trump said he had a very good conversation with Netanyahu about the fighting, adding, "He was hit, and he hit back, and I can't blame him for that. But both sides agreed, through me, to stop." Both sides agreed, through me, to stop. And then Israel attacked Tyre, so either Trump's statement that both sides agreed to stop is inaccurate, or Israel agreed to stop and then did not stop, or agreed to stop attacking Iran directly but not attacking Lebanon, or agreed to stop in a way that both sides interpret completely differently. Any of these explanations leads to the same conclusion. Trump does not have the leverage over Israeli military operations in Lebanon that his public statements suggest he has. And here is why that is structurally impossible to fix with phone calls and public warnings. The Israeli military operation in Lebanon is not being conducted by Netanyahu personally. It is being conducted by a military institution with its own operational logic, its own chain of command, its own assessment of what constitutes military necessity. When the Israeli military issued the evacuation order for the Christian quarter of Tyre, that decision was made by military commanders with operational objectives, not necessarily in real-time coordination with a political decision by Netanyahu in that specific moment. Trump can call Netanyahu. Trump can warn Netanyahu. Trump can tell Netanyahu that he will be on his own. But Trump cannot call every Israeli military commander who is making operational decisions in southern Lebanon. And Netanyahu, even if he genuinely wanted to stop every Israeli military operation in Lebanon simultaneously, does not have perfect real-time control over every operational decision being made by the IDF in the field. This is not a new problem. It is a structural feature of how modern military operations work. Command authority flows downward through layers. And at the tactical level, commanders make decisions based on the military situation in front of them, not based on phone calls between heads of state happening simultaneously. Al Jazeera reported that the latest escalation was prompted by Israel's bombardment of Beirut on Sunday, which prompted Iran to launch missiles at northern Israel. Trump reportedly called Netanyahu to ask him not to retaliate, but Israel launched its attacks on Iran early on Monday. Trump said the missiles were already on their way when he spoke to the Israeli Prime Minister. Already on their way. The planes were already airborne when Trump called. The decision had already been made. The operation was already executing. That is the reality of Trump's actual leverage over Israeli military operations. He can limit them after the fact. He said he managed to limit the operation, but he cannot stop them before they begin with sufficient speed and reliability to prevent them from activating Iran's automatic response doctrine, and Iran knows this. Part 4. The Hezbollah variable, the actor nobody can control. There is a dimension of this conflict that I think is being systematically underreported in Western media, and it is the dimension that explains more than any other why this conflict cannot be resolved through the US-Iran negotiation track that Trump is pursuing. CBS News reported directly that Hezbollah rejected the ceasefire agreement that Lebanon and Israel renewed last week. Israel and Hezbollah have continued to exchange fire daily since the ceasefire came into effect. Hezbollah is not a party to the US-Iran ceasefire. Hezbollah never signed any ceasefire. Hezbollah operates in southern Lebanon with its own military doctrine, its own operational objectives, its own command structure that reports to Tehran, but also has significant operational independence. And Hezbollah's continued operations in southern Lebanon give Israel ongoing daily military justifications for continued Israeli operations in southern Lebanon. Every day that Hezbollah fires at Israeli positions, Israel has a military reason to respond. Every Israeli response in Lebanon activates Iran's strategic doctrine. Every activation of Iran's strategic doctrine generates pressure that threatens the US-Iran deal Trump is trying to close. So here is the trap in its complete form. Iran's strategic doctrine is triggered by Israeli attacks on Lebanon. Israeli attacks on Lebanon are triggered in part by Hezbollah operations. Hezbollah operations continue because Hezbollah rejected the ceasefire. Hezbollah rejected the ceasefire because the ceasefire did not include the conditions Hezbollah considers non-negotiable, and those conditions, primarily related to Israeli military withdrawal from Lebanese territory, are conditions that Israel is not prepared to meet while Hezbollah remains armed and operational. Every actor in this chain is behaving rationally within its own framework, and the result of all those rational individual behaviors is a system that keeps generating escalation regardless of what Trump says in his Truth Social posts. This is not a problem that can be solved by a phone call between Trump and Netanyahu. This is a structural problem that requires a comprehensive settlement that includes Hezbollah, an actor that no American president can negotiate with directly because Hezbollah is designated as a terrorist organization by the United States government. Iran can negotiate with Hezbollah. Iran can potentially deliver Hezbollah's compliance with a ceasefire. But Iran will only deliver that compliance as part of a deal that meets Iran's own conditions, which include Israel stopping attacks on Lebanon. And Israel will not stop attacks on Lebanon while Hezbollah remains armed and operational and firing at Israeli positions daily. The circle is complete, and it is unbreakable through the negotiating framework Trump is using. Part 5. What the tire attacks reveal about the actual state of the deal. I want to use the tire attacks as a diagnostic tool because I think the specific details of what Israel did today, and when it did it, tell us more about the actual state of the peace negotiations than anything Trump has said publicly. Trump said this morning that the deal is in its final throes, 2 or 3 days away. And then Israel issued a forced displacement order for the Christian quarter of Tyre and launched strikes that killed 8 people. Now ask yourself this: if you were a military planner in the Israeli Defense Forces and you genuinely believed that a peace deal was 48 to 72 hours away, a deal that would end all hostilities, open the Strait of Hormuz, and provide a framework for regional stability, would you choose this specific moment to expand your operations in southern Lebanon, to include a neighborhood that had previously been explicitly protected? Would you take an action that you knew would activate Iran's strategic doctrine? That would give Iran justification to fire missiles at Israel again. That would threaten to collapse the peace negotiations that your American patron has been publicly describing as imminent for weeks? The answer is almost certainly no, unless you did not actually believe the deal was 48 to 72 hours away, unless your military assessment told you that the deal was not as close as Trump was saying, unless you decided that the operational objectives in southern Lebanon were more important than the optics of timing because the timeline for a deal was actually uncertain enough that waiting was strategically costly. The Tyre attacks are evidence, not conclusive evidence, but meaningful evidence, that the Israeli military's actual assessment of how close this deal is does not match what Trump is saying publicly. And that gap between what Trump says publicly and what the actors on the ground are actually doing is the most reliable indicator of where this conflict actually stands. Part 6. The historical pattern and what it predicts. I want to give you the historical context because what is happening right now follows a pattern that serious students of this region have seen before, and the pattern is not encouraging. Every major attempt to negotiate a comprehensive peace settlement in the Middle East in the last 4 decades has foundered on the same structural problem: the gap between what leaderships can agree to at the negotiating table and what military actors on the ground are willing to implement. In 1993, the Oslo Accords were signed on the White House lawn. Leaders shook hands, the world celebrated, and then the implementation began. And the implementation collapsed because the actors on the ground, settlers, military commanders, armed factions, were not bound by the handshakes of the leaders. In 2000 at Camp David, President Clinton came closer than anyone had before to a comprehensive Israeli-Palestinian peace deal, and it failed. Not because the leaders did not want a deal, because the gap between what the leaders could accept and what the constituencies they represented could accept was larger than any agreement could bridge. And now, in 2026, Trump is telling the world that a comprehensive deal with Iran is in its final throes, 2 or 3 days away, and Israel is bombing the Christian quarter of Tyre. Al Jazeera reported that Trump warned Netanyahu he would be on his own if attacks continue. Al Jazeera also reported that Netanyahu said in a televised statement that Israel has a full right to self-defense, and we are exercising it as required. As required, Netanyahu is not saying he will stop. He is saying Israel will do what it judges necessary, and what Israel judges necessary is in direct conflict with what Iran's strategic doctrine says it will respond to automatically. The historical pattern says that when the gap between what leaders say in negotiations and what military actors do on the ground becomes this large, the deal does not close, the deal collapses, and the next phase of conflict begins. I'm not predicting that. I'm saying the historical pattern points in that direction, and the burden of proof for why this time will be different lies with those who are claiming the deal is imminent. 3 things to watch. Al Jazeera reported that Iran warned of crushing measures if Israel continues its assault on Lebanon, including in the south. Watch whether Iran follows through on that warning in the next 24 to 48 hours. Iran's Mosaic defense is technically activated. The Tyre trigger occurred. If Iran launches another missile response, Trump's peace deal narrative collapses entirely before the week is over. If Iran holds, if Tehran calculates that restraint serves its negotiating position better than activation right now, the deal stays alive but on increasingly fragile terms. CBS News reported that Hezbollah rejected the ceasefire that Lebanon and Israel renewed last week. Watch whether there is any signal of a separate U.S. Hezbollah back channel opening. This would be extraordinary. America does not negotiate with designated terrorist organizations. But the structural reality is that no sustainable ceasefire in Lebanon is possible without Hezbollah's participation. If any intermediary, Qatar, Turkey, a European government, begins publicly suggesting that Hezbollah's conditions need to be addressed for a durable peace, that is the signal that Washington has privately acknowledged the limitation of the current negotiating framework. Watch the UN Security Council. The Secretary General of the United Nations has expressed deep alarm about what is happening in Tyre. If any permanent member of the Security Council, France, the United Kingdom, or most significantly China or Russia, calls for an emergency Security Council session specifically on the Tyre attacks, that is the moment when the international political cost of the current Israeli operations in Lebanon becomes measurable and concrete. That pressure, if it materializes, is the one variable that could change Netanyahu's calculation in a way that Trump's phone calls cannot. One final question. On June 9, 2026, Donald Trump said the deal is in its final throes. On June 9, 2026, Israel bombed the Christian quarter of Tyre, killing 8 people and forcing thousands to flee. On June 9, 2026, Iran warned of crushing measures if the attacks in Lebanon continue. So let me ask you the question that nobody on cable television is asking tonight. If Iran is truly as broken as Washington claims, no navy, no air force, no economy, 250% inflation, why does Iran not need to fire a single missile today to keep this conflict going? Why is the actor that Trump says is defeated and desperate the same actor that has engineered a situation where its adversary's closest ally keeps activating its automatic response doctrine without Iran having to do anything? Why is the actor that is supposedly losing the one that is sitting back and watching Israel do the strategic work that keeps Iran's leverage intact, without Iran spending a single dollar, a single missile, a single soldier? Because what Iran has achieved in this conflict is something that no military victory could have achieved. Iran has made Israel into the instrument of Iran's own strategic objectives. Every time Israel attacks Lebanon, Iran's doctrine is justified. Every time Iran's doctrine is justified, the peace deal gets harder to close on American terms. Every every time the peace deal gets harder to close, Trump's pressure on Netanyahu increases. Every time Trump's pressure on Netanyahu increases, Netanyahu faces a choice between his American patron and his domestic political survival. And Israel keeps choosing to attack Lebanon, which means Iran keeps winning, without firing a single missile today. And that is the story that nobody is telling you tonight.